Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, we have a less than stellar Final Fantasy game, one of the most hilariously bad examples of box art, and some monster brawling. Hi, I'm your host, Jared, and today is October 14th, 1992. Beloved to some, mocked by others, released 30 years ago was Final Fantasy Mystic Quest for the Super Nintendo. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is a turn-based fantasy RPG where you play as Benjamin, collecting 4 treasures of the elements. Battles used command-based menus with rotating second party members, getting experience points, and leveling up. Rather than purchasing or equipping new weapons and armor though, they are automatically upgraded as they are found throughout the adventure, all while going to towns, talking to NPCs, and discovering the epic story. Recall, if you will, that it was dubbed that 1992 was the year of the SNES RPG. One of the games spearheading this initiative was Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. However, the RPG genre was not big in the West, so Square developed Mystic Quest in Japan specifically for the American market. They believed that RPGs were just too hard for the Americans to get into, which is also why the US version of Final Fantasy IV, or 2, whatever, was significantly easier than the Japanese original. That's also why Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is a baby game for babies. It was not only conceived for a younger audience in mind, it was also made incredibly easy for kids to understand. To also help kids feel like they're getting into some action quicker, you can swing your weapons outside of battle, which can be used for some puzzle-solving elements. The story also has tons of jokes, it's light-hearted, and is a pretty short playthrough. Also, battles weren't random. All the enemies appear on the overworld, and you can jump, allowing you to avoid enemy fights whenever you want to. The world map is also a simple level select, like something out of Super Mario World. I've already made an entire video dedicated to Final Fantasy Mystic Quest like a lot of years ago. Feel free to revisit that for my full opinion on it. Viewers from Europe may be confused by what I'm talking about here. In Europe, there already was a game from Square called Mystic Quest, which we know as Final Fantasy Adventure, which is actually Seiken Densetsu, aka Adventures of Mana. So in Europe, this had its name changed to Mystic Quest Legend, and doesn't mention Final Fantasy at all. Despite trying to appeal to kids, the advertisements for Final Fantasy Mystic Quest basically insulted the intelligence of the reader, saying things like, an out-of-body experience, get a brain transplant, idiot, or drain your brain pan with a head lube and oil change. It also states how anyone who purchases the game can use a coupon inside the box to get a free strategy guide. Upon release, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest reviewed well. Magazines such as GamePro magazine rated the game highly, noting that it's perfect for button mashers to discover the RPG genre and a decent stopgap for Final Fantasy fans. Mystic Quest went mostly ignored by both American and Japanese audiences. When it came to broadening the appeal of RPG games, it failed. Oddly, that goal would not be realized until Final Fantasy VII. Mystic Quest wasn't entirely forgotten though. It got ported to the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console in 2010. There was a fan-developed HD remake of Mystic Quest until Square Enix shut that down. And for whatever it's worth, Benjamin appears in Theatrhythm Final Fantasy Curtain Call, the second game in the series on the Nintendo 3DS, where he is a playable party member and 2 Mystic Quest battle themes as selectable songs. This next game is one you've definitely seen before, even if you don't realize it yet. Also released this week in 1992 was Phalanx for the SNES. Phalanx is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up. You play as a spaceship, blasting every single thing that comes your way, picking up power-ups, and fighting bosses. You can stock up to 3 different weapons and power them up individually or change your ship's speed at will in the pause menu. Also, you don't instantly die after one hit and can even find some health-replenishing items along the way. There's also a cheat code that allows you to change the game's difficulty mode to funny, as in it becomes so absurdly difficult that it's funny. Phalanx, however, blends right in alongside every other space-themed shoot-'em-up on the SNES. It doesn't do enough to be worth someone's money or stand out, which is why Kemco sought to remedy that by making the weirdest box art they could. This is it. It's just an old guy sitting on a porch playing a banjo, making a weird face at you, and you can barely even notice the spaceship flying across. You've seen this before. This is one of those games that was always available at the rental store because the box art was so weird, none of us wanted to try it. Phalanx was originally on the X68000 computer, a giant beast of a PC from the late 80s. It didn't sell well on there, so they had to come up with something for the SNES port. As revealed by one of the people behind the cover, Matt Gus, he and his associate, Keith Campbell, were tasked to create a cover so that it would stand out among all the other SNES games. Their actual plan was to give it the weirdest cover art they possibly could, which I would say they succeeded, considering we still talk about that cover art to this day. Phalanx would receive some ports and re-releases, including a version on the Game Boy Advance. Sadly, the box art is just as bland as the game is. A wrestling game on the SNES, but only with giant monsters. Released this week in 1992, was King of the Monsters for the Super Nintendo. King of the Monsters is a one-on-one fighting game starring different kaiju, with some clearly inspired by Godzilla and King Kong. It plays more like a wrestling game than just a fighter, with plenty of suplexes and grappling. The edge of the ring is electrified and will bounce anyone right back in. To win a match, you also need to pin them to a count of 3. There's also lots of destruction to whatever city you're fighting on, and you can even pick up buildings or boats to attack the other with. After every single time you collect a power-up or grapple a guy, they'll celebrate by flexing or intensely headbanging. King of the Monsters was originally released as a Neo Geo game last year. The arcades and home Neo Geo AES got King of the Monsters 2 just a couple of months ago, so the SNES versions were lagging behind a bit. The port itself is also lackluster. It doesn't have the graphics and sound effects for that real oomph of the arcade original, and it's missing 2 of the playable characters. At its release, even Nintendo Power reviewed it with an average score of only 3.2 out of 5. But it didn't stop me from renting it a ton as a kid. I loved the city destruction, and around that time, I was watching a ton of movies like Godzilla and Gamera. So the giant monster aesthetic really appealed to me. My favorite guy was Beatlemania. That said, the console ports aren't very good, and you should stick with the Neo Geo versions whenever you can. A Sega Genesis version of King of the Monsters would come out later next year. The SNES and Sega ports never got a re-release of any kind, but they would both get a home version of King of the Monsters 2. The Neo Geo original was included in SNK Arcade Classics Volume 1 for the PlayStation 2, PlayStation Portable, and Nintendo Wii, which is also now available for download on the Nintendo Switch. Some of the King of the Monsters characters also show up in SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters for the Neo Geo Pocket and Nintendo DS, and make appearances in Neo Geo Battle Coliseum, a one-on-one fighting game featuring tons of Neo Geo characters. As far as new games though, since 2008, we've never seen the King of the Monsters ever again. For the other games that came out this week, here's Editor Dylan.
One more SNES game that came out this week was Irem Skins Game, which I guess is a sequel to Irem Shirts Game? I don't know. Let's keep the sports game train going with World Trophy Soccer on the Genesis. There's a noticeably smaller price gap between the loose and complete copies of Genesis games compared to other consoles, especially sports games like this. It's also why your local game store lumps them all together in the bargain bin. Speaking of bargain bin, one of the Game Boy releases this week was Barbie Game. Girl! Wait, special Barbie belt bag offer? Let me see this. $10 value? Now that's a bargain. I don't know how you could top that, but the Game Boy also released Xenon 2. It's your standard vertical space shooter. Is what I would have said if there wasn't a cool shop where you buy and sell guns and upgrades to fit your playstyle. Unfortunately, it's incredibly slow, to the point that it's practically unplayable. Is what I would have said if I didn't play it at 4 times the speed on an emulator, I mean, legitimate copy. Changing the subject, the NES had Spider-Man Return of the Sinister Six, which it's one of the better LJN games. It doesn't hold a candle to Maximum Carnage, but I still had fun with it. Keeping it on the NES, the last game that came out this week was Power Blade 2, a side-scroller from Taito. I haven't even heard of Power Blade 1, so I fully expect this to suck. And after playing through a few levels, I could confidently say, dude, this game is amazing! It's one of those rare games that takes inspiration from the very best, but only the good bits. Paying attention, LJN? It stars Duke Nukem? You know, from Terminator. I don't remember his real name. You choose your stage like Mega Man, and the responsive controls allow you to run, jump, and climb like Ninja Gaiden. Your attacks feel like Strider, but with a boomerang, only you can explore and find upgrades for it like Metroid. There's power-ups, optional bosses, an inventory system with consumable items, stamina bars that judge how far your attack reaches, an optional secret suit that transforms you into freaking RoboCop with a jetpack. It's like this game was made specifically for me. I need this game in my collection. I wonder how much it is. Oh, well then. Good thing I could play it on an emulator, which leaves us a grand total of 9 games released on these 4 consoles this week in 1992. I doubt we'll see another Taito-made NES game that expensive in at least 1, maybe even 2 weeks. And now here's Jared with much more affordable prices for you.
Thank you, Dylan. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest value hasn't seen much of an increase. It released with a suggested retail price of only $39.99, and now you can get just the game for only $20. And if you got the complete box and manual, it's barely over $80. And that's not terrible on its own, but it's pitiful compared to Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI. Phalanx isn't worth all that much either. The game alone is barely over $30, but wouldn't you know it, with that box and manual, it goes up to $175. King of the Monsters isn't too impressive either, only $17 for the game, and with a box and manual, it goes to $70. And that's it for today. Next week, we got 2 FMV games, some aliens, and an all-new console. I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. Please like the video and leave a comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you already are a subscriber, thank you so much. As much as I like to make fun of it, I am glad that I do own Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. I don't have the strategy guide, but I do have the map that came with the game, just in case you got lost somehow.